Everybody please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Catherine Burke, who is an educator, author, and director of Historic Bridges of the Hudson Valley. She's also author of 2 books, Images of America books on Hudson River Bridges, and that is the topic that she's going to talk to us about today. So welcome, Kathy. Thanks so much for joining us. If you would like to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Go ahead and get started.
Yeah. Okay, welcome everyone. I have to say, first of all, that this is my first remote presentation, so bear with me. I'm used to having an audience, having taught in the classroom for many, many years. I always had to see the faces in order to know maybe I'm talking too long. So feel free to wave. I know Sarah said wait till the end for questions, but if you have anything that you want a quick clarification on, Sarah said it would be fine if you let her know in the chat, and if it's something she wants to interrupt me with, that would work. So that's fine. So I am the director of Historic Bridges of the Hudson Valley. This is my 6th year doing that. And I knew nothing about the bridges when I wrote the first book in 2007. And I got to know the Bridge Authority pretty well, and all of their bridges. And that's how they came to ask me to become the director when Historic Bridges was created. It's a education not-for-profit that's specifically designed to educate on the bridges, and we do STEM and STEAM curriculum as well. So we'll get a little bit into that later, but right now, let's start with the Bridge Authority. So these 3 gentlemen here were the first commissioners of the New York State Bridge Authority. And the Bridge Authority was set up, it was actually an idea of FDR in 1932, when the communities of Greene County and Columbia County wanted a bridge in their area. They were hoping that Route 23 would connect them to New England. It never actually did that, but they petitioned for the bridge, and because it was during the Depression, FDR said, no way, you'll have to fund it. How about setting up an authority? And so that's how the Bridge Authority came to be. It came through legislation in 1932, and it was set up to be autonomous and separate from any political mechanisms in Albany, and most importantly, to be separate from any budget, ebb and flow, just to ensure that the tolls collected, and this is still the case, the tolls collected are used to maintain the bridges only. They have paid off the bridges, and many people think that they shouldn't have tolls anymore. But when you think about the cost of the toll, $1.45 to cross one way, you only pay one way, less than a cup of coffee, it still is a good deal to know you're on a safe bridge. So these guys here, if I can introduce you to them, on the left is Addison Jones, and he's from Catskill. In the center is Clifford Miller. He became the first chairman of the board. And then on the right is Robert Hoe. Miller's from Columbia, Robert Hoe's from Poughkeepsie. Robert Hoe actually stayed on the Bridge Authority board until his death in 1960, and he is still the longest serving board member. Now, this should look familiar to you if you're in the Poughkeepsie area, but what's missing is the Mid-Hudson Bridge. This was the view from Poughkeepsie to Highland Landing in 1925. Highland Landing would pretty much disappear with the approach for the Mid-Hudson Bridge, but it had a little train station. It was a nice little community. The purpose of the Mid-Hudson Bridge, the reason those 2 communities really wanted the bridge, was to transport all of the produce, not just from Ulster County, but from beyond that in Western New York, down to the Bronx market. The small truck, delivery truck, had become very popular for delivery, and millions of dollars of produce was transported across the Mid-Hudson Bridge within the first year. So it was really, really necessary. That's Governor Al Smith there, bent over looking at the Cornerstone. The Cornerstone was placed on the Poughkeepsie side, and it was placed there in October of 1925. Now, the bridge should have been completed in about 2 or 3 years, but it didn't open until 1930. This is the Anchorage on the east side of the river. It's just south of Call Rock. Call Rock, as many of you know, is this big kind of like boulder looking thing, but it's enormous. And they thought initially they would just have the bridge be on top of that, but they decided to move it a little bit further south. This is a caisson. This is the east caisson. The caisson is used on bridge piers to build the base of the pier. What it is, it floats in. This one came in on March of, let me see, back to my notes here. Dates are not my thing, believe it or not. Of 1925. Sorry, I'm losing my notes here. And what happened was what they do with the caisson, it's a little hard to explain, but it comes in looking like a boat, and those are steel sides with the metal supports. And as it's sunk to the bottom, there's a cutting edge on the bottom of the caisson and a false bottom. So if it goes down properly, as it sinks, they build up the sides to keep it above the top of the water. And then once the cutting edge gets to the bottom, they use that to help get through all the muck, and they dig it out from the inside, because this is open on the inside. It's not a closed caisson like we think of with the Brooklyn Bridge. But what happened was, it was kind of interesting. I was at a book talk in Rhinebeck about 4 years ago, and a woman stood up for a question, and she said to me, my father worked on the construction of the Mid-Hudson Bridge. And he always said that the bridge project was almost abandoned because a caisson tipped, and they almost didn't get it righted. And I had never heard that, and nobody else in the audience had heard it. There was about 75 people there. So I took her information so that I could contact her, and I did some research. And sure enough, it did happen. So I have side-by-side pictures here to show you. This photo here on the left is that one of the caisson where it's supposed to be. And then on the right is what happened. And that was on the morning, get some notes here. On the morning of July 27th, 1927 at 4:30 a.m., the caisson tipped, listing to an angle of 42.5 degrees. So think about that. From the vertical. So it went from the vertical, tipped over in less than a minute. Tipped over to the point where the east edge dropped 29 feet and the west edge rose 11 feet. And if you can imagine, the engineers and the workers were pretty distressed. So we also have, just to back off for a minute, we have interpretive signs at all the bridges. And when I was trying to describe this, I had an engineer do a diagram of it so that it could be better explained. And if you look at this diagram, this is pretty much what happened. The bottom of the Hudson, we all think it's kind of like a swimming pool, but it's not. It's, it's got all kinds of crevices and valleys, and it's not flat, obviously. So as it goes down, the caisson had got stuck in here. And what they had to do over the course of almost 2 years, they had to do what this is called a car float here. And then we have the barge on this side. And what the barge was trying to do was pull up. And this was, so we've got it pulling up this way here and pulling that way here. And in the meantime, they have equipment and men who are down there digging out from the inside and down here to write this caisson. Now, this took quite a while. I can get to the next slide. And you'll see that it tipped in July of 27. They had to keep pulling on it all that time through the winter, and tidal flow, river flow, ice, everything. And they didn't get any movement on it until May of 1928, where they saw a slight movement. And once they saw this slight movement, they were able to keep that momentum going, so that this is pretty much straight up in August. But it took until November. I'll go back to here because we don't want to get there yet. It took to November for them to get it to the point where they could start to fill it again. And then, of course, it was winter with ice. So they held off until the next spring to finish it up. And as you can imagine, big ceremony, flag, all the important guys around, laying the last stone on the top of the pier. Now, in the meantime, the West Pier had been completed back in June of 28. So it was waiting for a long time. But this we refer to as a Herculean effort. It was an engineering epic, they called it in the engineering review. But if they had not been able to write it, they would have given up the project. In the meantime, American Bridge Company had fabricated all of the steel for the bridge. These are the towers. And what they did was they fabricated them in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, put them together to make sure they fit perfectly. And then they disassembled them, put them on trains and then ships, and brought them up to Poughkeepsie. And they were waiting on the shore in Poughkeepsie from, as you can see down here, February of 1928. So they were laying there waiting all this time and should have been installed, but they had to write the caisson. So once the caisson was righted, the piers were completed, they installed those towers, they put the towers up. Once the towers are up on a suspension bridge, the next thing to do is to install what they call the footbridge. And that's this part underneath. And you'll see better when we do the Bear Mountain. I'll show you on those photos. All these images, plus lots more, are in the book. So you'll see all that in the book. But this is a footbridge. And what it is, it's cables that are run, and then the wood is woven so that it's like a floor. And it's about 4 feet wide at least. And the workers can walk on it. There's actually photos of just regular people using that to get across the river. So that's kind of wild if you think about it. That's Poughkeepsie down here. This is the South Anchorage on the east side, and that's the North Anchorage on the east side. Once the main cables, and they're right above the footbridge here, once those are complete, then the suspender ropes are attached and dropped on the Mid-Hudson Bridge. I'm sure you've all been across the Mid-Hudson Bridge. Those truss supports are affectionately referred to as the pork chops because they look just like pork chops. And the suspender rope is attached with a socket to the top of that truss, and that's what holds up the bridge. You can see also the stringers that are making up the deck. Okay, if you check out this date here, August 14th, 1930, the bridge is going to open on August 25th of 1930. So they don't have much time to finish this up here. But this is the concreting of the bridge. Kind of take a look and see this equipment. That's one of the things I find the most interesting is the change from when the Mid-Hudson was built to the last span of the Newburgh Beacon, the second span, the difference in technology and how they built all these different things. So here's opening day, huge crowds, thousands of people. Governor Franklin Roosevelt was there. The previous governor, Al Smith, was there. Lots of speeches, parades, great time, even though it was during the Depression. The bridge, they went across the bridge, FDR, Al Smith, and their wives. Obviously, this is Eleanor cutting the ribbon. She cut the ribbon on the west side. Mrs. Smith had already cut the ribbon on the east side. This is Colonel Frederick Stewart Green. He was, at the time, in charge of the whole project. He was the director for the New York State Department of Public Works, which now is actually the DOT. And this is Ralph Majeski, and this is Daniel Moran. Now, I've always wondered why I've never seen any pictures of Daniel Moran smiling. And when I found out about the tipped caisson, I think that's probably why. Daniel Moran was a longtime engineer, and his specialty was the substructure, the piers. And he had worked on the piers for the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge. And that's why he was brought onto this project by Ralph Majeski. Ralph Majeski partnered with a number of different people. Right after this, actually just before this, he had partnered with Mr. Masters, because right now the firm, for the longest time actually, has been Majeski and Masters. Mr. Moran also worked on the Wirt Street Bridge and the Bear Mountain. So he was pretty much an expert on these things. So for all of that to have gone wrong, I guess that's why he's not a smiling guy. That day, people were allowed to walk back and forth and enjoy the beautiful views from the river and enjoy the beauty of the bridge itself. And this is a couple days later when things had kind of calmed down. Looks a little bit different than it does now. It has really a nice old classic look to it. You don't really get to see all of those things as you go across the bridge anymore. We have so many more, you got the more efficient lights and things like that. But the toll house is still standing. Several years ago, they had to take out all of the wood and, the steps gone from the inside due to fire hazard. But the structure is still standing. So the Bridge Authority was actually created to fund the Rip Van Winkle. The reason they have the Mid-Hudson Bridge is in 1933, they purchased it from New York State. New York State didn't want to have to maintain it. They didn't want to operate it. So they decided to give it to the Bridge Authority. So the Bridge Authority purchased it, and that was their first bridge. One of the first things the Bridge Authority wanted to do when they acquired the Mid-Hudson was reduce the toll. The initial toll on the Mid-Hudson Bridge was 80 cents per car with the driver. Every passenger was 10 cents more. And you actually had to pay a toll to walk across the bridge of about 10 cents. So they thought that was really way too high for the average person to pay. And many people still, particularly in the winter, would walk across the ice instead of going on the bridge, would take boats and ferries instead of going across the bridge. But the state said no, they wouldn't allow it. The Bridge Authority kept trying, but then they moved on to build the Rip Van Winkle. So these photos I had gotten from the Smithsonian. This, as you can see up here, for those of you that know, that's Olana. And almost all of the construction photos, Olana is overlooking the building of the bridge, which I always thought was kind of poetic. But the Rip Van Winkle, of all of the Hudson River bridges, goes over almost as much land as it does water. So you can see they always, whenever with construction, would put in temporary railroad to move all the supplies. So here's the piers, put in much the same as the ones on the Mid-Hudson Bridge. There was some indication I found that one of the piers, one of the channel piers for the Rip Van Winkle was actually a closed caisson because of the depth of the water, but I haven't found any other information on that yet. So now the Rip Van Winkle is a cantilever truss bridge, and for what that means for the cantilever, here's the piers, okay, and you can see it kind of goes up this way, and then it's straight, and it goes back down. This cantilever is a little easier to see because what a cantilever is, and I have the next picture will show it even more, it allows for a much longer spread between the piers, particularly for the shipping channel. You want to make sure that you don't have any piers in the middle of your channel, and that allows for that. You can see that this is kind of, it's a creeper crane is what it's called, and it literally creeps along the bridge to build the next section past where it's already been constructed. And you can start to see, this is the beginning of the cantilever section that's going to hold the largest through truss piece over the main channel. And this shows it the best, I think. These right here, these 4 sections are called false work, and they're floating on, they're actually resting on barges, but they're there to help support the structure while it's being constructed. So if you look here, this is kind of like the apex. This stretch here is anchored down here, and this is the force that will hold up this and what's dropped in between. So this is the administration building during construction. If I'm not sure how well you could see it on yours, but right through here is where the bridge is being constructed. Now they had, the Bridge Authority insisted on local labor when they started the construction on the bridge. And they stuck with that and ended up with at least 75 to 80% of the people that worked on the bridge were from the area. They wanted to make sure that they were bringing in local jobs. A lot of the companies would come up out of New York City and bring their workers with them, and the Bridge Authority didn't want that to happen. There was one strike during the time of the construction of the bridge. It was settled pretty quickly. The workers wanted more money. And the way they settled that was to give them more work hours to get them more money. The hourly rate was not increased, but they went from a 30-hour week to a 40-hour week, and they seem to be happy with that. So here they're laying the roadbed. It's concrete. There's some pipes you can see that are poured, and this is one of the things that you'll see as the newer bridges are built. The technology that comes into play is pretty amazing, but they're using the floaters and hand settling all the concrete and all those kind of things there. Here's opening day. They coincided the opening of the bridge in 1935 with the 150th anniversary of the city of Hudson. So it was a really pretty big deal. And this is a postcard I love. It's obviously, they make it look much flatter on this area. And if you've been up to the Rip, you know that it doesn't really look like this. But what I like is it clearly shows if you're traveling eastbound on the bridge, the toll is collected here. If you're traveling westbound, the toll is collected right here. Now, starting November 1st up at the Rip, it's going to be cashless. So they have this don't tell them I said this, really ghastly looking gantry. That's gonna be right there, and eventually they'll be taking down that toll booth too. A number of people at the Bridge Authority thought it would be really cool if they could have somehow made the gantry look like this old picture, which really would be amazing. The structure's not going anywhere. That's a historic building, so that will be there. Up on top, since the bridge opened, is a weather vane of Rip Van Winkle, and it's still there today. So if you go up there, make sure you take a look. Now there is, that opened in 2019, the Hudson River Skywalk. The year was sidewalk, excuse me, put on the outside of the bridge back in the 90s. And then with the Skywalk, they extended, and that's cantilevered out off the bridge to make more room for traffic inside. It's still one lane each way, but if vehicles are much bigger now, so it made a lot more sense to have the sidewalk on the outside, a little safer for pedestrians as well. But this is the Hudson River Skywalk. It's the birthplace of American art, and Historic Bridges sponsors an arts festival at the Rip every September. We just had our 5th annual. So moving down the river, the next bridge that became a Bridge Authority bridge was the Bear Mountain. And you can see here, there's Robert Hull. He was the guy sitting on the right side. I don't know if anybody recognizes him. That's Robert Moses. He had some things to do with the Bear Mountain, not as much as he likes to think he should get credit for. But the Bridge Authority purchased the Bear Mountain Bridge from the Bear Mountain Hudson River Bridge Company that built and operated the bridge for the first 16 years for about $2.5 million. And that was basically what was owed on the bridge at the time. So let's go back and see how the Bear Mountain came to be. The HRMMs had gifted really to the state of New York a fair amount of parkland in the Palisades and for Bear Mountain Park. And this is as you can see, this is a photo from, this is not in the book, but this is a photo from Palisades Interstate Park Commission. That's the construction, the Bear Mountain Inn construction right there. So it started in probably about 1910, became very popular. Steamships, lots and lots of people coming. Ferries, if you took a ferry, if you drove up to Peekskill and you tried to take a ferry across, you just might be stuck sleeping in your car overnight. It was that crowded. So the HRMMs decided that they needed to build a bridge. In the meantime, Terry and Tench, their steel contracting, one of the biggest in the world at the time, had just completed the Wirt Street Bridge right up the river from where we should be in the Maritime Museum, had just completed that structure, and it opened in 1921. And they were looking to build another bridge. So they came south down the river, met with the HRMMs, had the same engineer, Robinson, design the Bear Mountain Bridge. And they brought the Roeblings with them. The Roebling cables are on the Wirt Street Bridge, and Terry and Tench wanted them on the Bear Mountain Bridge. Roland Harriman liked the idea, so did his mother. His mother didn't want to pay for it. So Roland set up the Bear Mountain Hudson River Bridge Company and set about getting investors. And that's where we started to do Bear Mountain Bridge. Now, the Bear Mountain Bridge was done very quickly. It began in March of 23. Actually, they signed the contract in March of 23. They began work in May of 23. And both piers are on the land. So they didn't have to worry about the caissons and all that. It's much deeper in the river here than it is up in by Poughkeepsie or even up by the Rip. This pier is totally on the land. This one is a little bit on in the water, but for the most part, it made it a much quicker process. Now, I had told you I would show you how the footbridge is installed. This is a barge, and there's 4 cables on it, and the barge will go across and back. And what it does is it lifts this cable up so that it'll go from the top of the tower to the top of the tower and back down. And what you'll have is this, eventually, that's how you get this footbridge over there. Okay. There's considerably more pictures in the book. There's about 220 construction photos. So you'll see the process a lot better. But this shows all the parts of the bridge. Okay, so there's the main cable. You can see that it's pretty much complete. It's all already strapped and wrapped here. And then suspender ropes. You notice there are none here. The Bear Mountain Bridge is unique in that the back area here, these are called the backstays, are what's called unloaded. They don't carry any weight. And that's one reason why, that's actually the reason why this is hyperbolic, it's an arc, and this is taut straight, because this goes straight back to the anchorage with no weight pulling on it. This part of the bridge on the outsides of the tunnel are supported by the truss underneath. And that's because it's, you know, it's basically like a girder structure. When we get to the Kingston Rhinecliff in a minute, you'll see what I'm talking about. But so this is a separate thing. Okay, so you can see here, they've got the suspender ropes coming down. They hook into the sprocket similar to the Mid-Hudson, but the Bear Mountain cable goes all the way below the deck. And they did that on purpose to not obstruct the view. If you've been across the Mid-Hudson, you know, you look out and you see bridge. You don't look out and see the Hudson River necessarily, but on the Bear Mountain, it's an unobstructed view, so it's beautiful. But then it has the truss underneath. This is a special feature. Again, they were very concerned that there was a lot of noise coming out of New York City. Oh no, you're gonna put this ugly bridge in that beautiful area. So they were very, very careful to make sure that it had soft lines and it followed the natural look. So if you look at the towers with the sloping cables, it mimics the mountains around it. This mimics the entrance to the tunnels for the trains as they go underneath the bridge. Once the main cable is complete, it comes down and you can see that it's all wrapped here. They bring it down here and it ends up being separated again into clusters and attached to eye bars. And that's kind of like a metal, you know, like a long metal stick with a circular thing on the top for it to be connected to. And you'll have an eye bar connected to an eye bar, connected to an eye bar, connected to an eye bar. And those can be buried deep underground and then are cemented to keep it a tight, firm anchorage. It looks like it's right on the edge. If you looked at the administration building for the Bear Mountain Bridge, the anchorage, actually this part that's buried underneath is on the far side of the building from the river and way underneath the building. So it's pretty far down. One of the other things that they had to do with the Bear Mountain Bridge is the goat trail. And that's what this is affectionately called. The construction of the goat trail cost almost as much as the construction of the bridge. and pretty much bankrupted the project. The toll house that's on this side over by Peekskill, who's that, Philip, that said he's from Peekskill? That toll house was not a toll for the bridge. That toll house was a toll for the road, and they needed that for the insurance in case there was any casualties on the road. But you could see it actually cut right through the mountain, and they had to be very, very careful because with all of the Hudson River bridges, you could not impact the train that was going by. So this photo here shows you the bridge is actually almost ready to open. They're just about to take down the footbridge. The toll booth is all set. Administration building will not be completed when they open it on Thanksgiving. Here it is in December. You can see it's still being worked on. We have a special museum classroom space where we do classes down at the Bear Mountain, and this is a class of students that came up from Yonkers to actually take a tour. So we do, as I said, STEM education. So moving north, this is these are interpretive signs that we have for the Kingston Rhine Cliff. I thought because you guys are coming out of the maritime, you might be more interested in the Kingston Rhine Cliff. But all of our interpretive signs, all the bridges have interpretive signs. Some are brought in for the winter, so I believe the Rip already brought them in, but it has the construction, it has the important people that built the bridges and any other important things about it. The Kingston Rhine Cliff had Mohawk iron workers that did a lot of the high tower work. Now, this is the original design for the bridge. It was supposed to be suspension. It was designed by D.B. Steinman, and it was designed to go, and this is Rondout Creek right here, it was designed to go almost from the end of the creek across to Rhine Cliff, and that's why it's called the Kingston Rhine Cliff Bridge, even though actually there was an additional, I just found this one last year. I always thought it was just a suspension bridge, but he also had designed a possible truss bridge. They moved it about 3 miles north. And at the time, if you think this is during the middle 1950s, with the development of the interstate, the idea was to connect 87 with the Taconic. That did this about as well as the Route 23 connected to New England. But so here's a caisson for the Kingston Rhine Cliff. You can see they're hammering in the H piles and getting that all set up. They used what they called tremie concrete. It was the first time that piers on the Hudson River Bridge had been poured into the water, and it kind of cures it a little bit differently. It doesn't crack as much. It keeps it cooler. These are some of the iron workers. As you can see, this is way before most of the safety protocols they have now. And I thought this was a really cool looking picture. You can see where they're connecting. What they did was they built the truss on the top of the pier and kind of cantilevered it to the next one. More really cool pictures. There's the false work here that's helping to support in between the piers. You can see that there. I want you to take a notice right here. I'm going to show you a better picture in a second, but this is called a box pier. There's 2 box piers in the Kingston Rhine Cliff Bridge, and they have a couple of purposes. And one that you can see from here is that it has to connect this really deep underdeck truss to the girder section that comes off the approaches. You'll see that in a second. Here's some more. But they just work their way across the river connecting the piers. The Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge was the longest underdeck truss bridge in the world when it opened. So our bridges are actually pretty impressive. So here's the box pier. So as you can see, here's the girth section. If they had just a regular pier, they never would be able to connect the truss section that was so deep with the girder section. The other thing about this is it's hollow inside. So there's rooms in there. And during construction, the men would go in there to get their paychecks. So that was kind of cool. And here's more finishing up, meeting in the middle. There's actually two channels on the Kingston-Rhinecliff. One major one is on the east side, and then a smaller channel on the right side. I've always thought the Kingston-Rhinecliff looks better from underneath than it does from on top. And then the opening, they had a soft opening in February of 1957. The river had frozen and IBM was open, and they wanted to make sure people could get to work. So they hadn't completely finished the bridge. There were some kind of hunky barriers on the sides, not the complete concrete rails that they needed, but they opened it just to make sure people could get to work. And there's Averill Harriman, whose family built the Bear Mountain Bridge. They're at the opening in February, all set to go skiing, apparently. And then again in May, when they were supposed to do it, the planned date initially, they did a rededication ceremony. So I don't know if you could see, we've moved farther south. This guy waving right there is Rockefeller. And he actually did a special ceremony called Breaking of the Waters to start the construction of the north span of the Newburgh-Beacon Bridge. This, for people in Kingston, this company should look familiar. But here's the piers, and this is where you start to see now these huge cranes and barges and a lot different technology. Although the north span was the end of an era in many ways, they still used rivets to put the original bridge together. And it's about that time in the 1960s where they started to switch over to high tension steel bolts. But you can see it very similar to the construction of the Kingston-Rhinecliff with the truss sections. Again, they would start at the pier, use the false work, and build out from there. Okay. It's pretty cool from underneath. And there's Rocky ready to open the bridge. He was not real popular around this time because of this bridge. He decided to make it a 2-lane bridge instead of a 4-lane bridge because he didn't want to take any federal funds for it. There he is cutting the ribbon. And it was actually a very beautiful structure. It was originally was silver. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have driven across that. I had to drive across that to go to college, actually, and anybody that complains about going across the Newburgh-Beacon now because it's so narrow, I just have to tell them that's crazy. Going one way with a 18-wheeler coming at you on a 2-lane bridge, nothing like it. So, but it was an award winner. The American Association of Steel Construction had awarded the bridge. It was awarded for its beauty. It got a meritorious award for a beautiful structure. Not long after the bridge opened, it became known by many truckers with CBs as the parking lot on 84. It did not hold up to traffic. As you can see, this is not horrible traffic. This is the original structure, and here's the new Southspan being built. This structure over here was the administration building, and it's now maintenance. I'm showing you this because this is a caisson. It was built on the shore. Steel Style is still a company that's in Newburgh. They built this caisson. This caisson, when it was put in place, tipped. Technology being what it is, it only took 3 weeks to write this one. I had an engineer just to help me with a diagram here. What happened, here's the caisson. This is water. This is, and both of the cranes are floating on a barge. And what they're supposed to do remember we talked about the caisson goes down, it's supposed to pull out the sediment so that the caisson can go farther. And it settles down not necessarily on bedrock, but on secure surface. What happened was one of the cranes broke down and the other one kept going. So of course it tipped. So what they did was put in the H piles, all underwater, H piles down there. And then they had this, and you guys are in my way here, a hydraulic jack that pushed back on this while this crane that broke down was emptying it out. And 3 weeks later, they were ready to go. Another cool structure picture. One of the other differences about the Southspan, which is really pretty cool and is pretty much how bridges are built today, you could see all these, that was all built in place. But what they did for the Southspan was they had an assembly yard that was constructed, and this is the permit for the assembly yard. So this kind of gives you some kind of idea of what it was like. And the assembly yard was used to construct sections of the bridge. And about 30% of the structure was assembled out here, floated up the river, and then set in place on the bridge. And it kind of shortened up the construction time. This is River Road here. If you know Newburgh, all the restaurants and everything are way up this way. And this is a pretty classic picture here of lifting in the last section. And this is what they did. You can see that it's on a barge, and then they would just lift it into place. One of our engineers who's still with the Bridge Authority, George Fong, was a young guy when he came up to work on this bridge, and he said he was standing right up there. I don't know if you can see him. George and two other guys were standing right up there, if you can believe that. Again, we're talked about the new technology. That's a whole lot quicker to concrete this bridge. And you can notice it's actually a 4-lane bridge. There's 3 lanes for travel and 1 breakdown lane. Once the South Span opened, pretty much right away, they closed the North Span and widened it. In order to widen it, you have to change the abutments. The abutments secure the bridge to the land on either end, basically. So this was not sufficient for a 3-lane. It was just for the 2 lanes. So they redid that. They redid all the bearings. If they were not functioning, they took them out, the new ones, or they just reconditioned them. This is the kind of, I like this photo because you can see the original bridge was silver. The South Span was built of cordon steel that was not supposed to rust. It didn't actually prove to be as good as it was supposed to be, so they did end up painting it eventually. But you can see the new steel, and what they did was go through the truss and add reinforcements so that the force on the bridge was sufficient for the 3 lanes. This kind of helps to show what they had done to make the wider lanes back on this section was to cantilever out from the deck some additional width. So it is safe for anybody who thinks it's just the roadway that's stuck out there. No, it's more steel that's cantilevered out. You can see that a lot of the stringers were added again more on top or reinforced. And within the through section of the bridge, now there was no walkway there anymore. They went right to the steel with the roadway. So that's how they were able to widen the bridge without widening the through truss. Pretty nice contraption for concreting the roadway. And wouldn't you love to be this guy? What they had to do, obviously, to make it twin spans, when they finished the widening, the last thing they did was paint the north span brown to match the south span. And there's the twin spans, more fraternal than identical, obviously, but the twin spans of the Newburgh Beacon. The Bridge Authority is known for maintaining their structures, some of the best maintained in the country. You know, people don't appreciate it when they're stuck in traffic, but they do keep the bridges in great shape. This is the redecking of the Southspan. That was done 2007, it was maybe 2012. And they used prefabbed concrete slabs that came in. They thought was going to be a better way to do it. But when they went to do the redecking, the project that's right now, which you can see here, this is what they're working on. They had to strip all the way to the steel. They checked the steel, made sure that nothing needed to be repaired on there. And this is being poured in place. With the Southspan, it was, as I had said, a full four lanes. So even while they were putting in the panels, they still had enough laneage to keep traffic flowing. Because this bridge is narrower, they really only have the one lane. So that's why they went with the poured concrete instead of doing the other. And that's about it. And I think I did it, Sarah. Did I get it? Yep. Under an hour. But if you have any questions, I know there's all kinds of stuff I have on my notes here that I didn't get to, but you know, the bridges are pretty amazing. So
that was great, Kathy. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Folks who are watching, if you have questions and you want to drop them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand for questions, I have a question. When you were talking about the special kind of cement they were using in the caissons, I immediately thought of Rosendale cement, and I wondered if any of the Hudson River bridges had Rosendale cement as part of their construction.
You know, I don't know about the Rosendale cement. I would imagine they were. I could check that for you, Sarah, and I'll get back to you, which I always do. So if anybody has a question that you stump me on, I'll get back to you.
Sorry to ask a question that's not easy to answer.
Not so much, right. The Tremmy cement is my understanding, and this is where I'm definitely an educator, not an engineer. The Tremmy cement is more of the process than the type of cement necessarily. Most cement, in fact, if you post holes, I remember my dad used to do them, and he would pour the cement into the hole, the already mixed cement. My husband does them, and he has water in there, and he pours in the cement. So it's that kind of a thing where, you know, it will actually set up better.
Okay, other Sarah asked a question. She said, why did the engineers change their minds about making the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge a suspension bridge?
It wasn't so much that they changed their minds. There was a lot of back and forth. It took about 5 years to decide where the bridge was going to be located. And I'm trying to remember the guy's name, Ralph Bellamy, does that make sense? Was the head of transportation for New York State at the time. And he was a big interstate guy. And he really wanted the interstates to be successful. So he wanted to connect to the interstate. There was also a group of people who thought there's a mess in Poughkeepsie with the bridge where it enters into Poughkeepsie, the Mid-Hudson Bridge. They didn't want it to go right into, you know, the little hamlet of Rhinecliff. So they moved it north. And once they moved it north, they could no longer do the suspension bridge. There wasn't the, you know, the right area the right rock bed out on this on the shoreline for it to be a suspension bridge. So that's why they ended up going with the underdeck truss.
All right, well, since we're talking about Kingston Rhine Cliff, I have another question,
Okay.
which maybe is unanswerable. So I know from our captains at the Maritime Museum that the center of the Kingston Rhine Cliff Bridge, where the bridge is the highest, the water is the shallowest. Did they know that? Was there, I assume so, but it's like, it's funny, it looks like that's where the channel would be, or where like a tall ship could get through, but it's too shallow.
No, actually the channels are they're off center. If you look at the bridge, in fact, this is a pretty good, this is our historic bridges print. And you can see there's one channel that's here and one channel that's here. And I'm pretty sure this is the main deep one.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
That's kind of a secondary. So what it does, and it kind of freaks people out when they drive across it. There's a whole lot of people that think the Empire State Trail shouldn't be there because of this, but the bridge goes up in arcs and back down. And it's part of it is for engineering. Part of it was a whole design to appreciate the views of the Catskills and all that kind of thing. What it does is it creates this whole area of feeling like you're wide open in the middle of a mountain, I guess. But because as you're coming up, you can't really see down the other side. So, but that's more of the way it's designed, not so much having anything to do with the ships. All of the bridges have the required clearance from the Coast Guard. Anytime you have a bridge, in fact, when they added the sidewalk on the outside of the Rip Van Winkle, they had to get Coast Guard approval. When they did the bump outs, they had to get Coast Guard approval. Even though it doesn't change the height, anything having to do with maritime has to have Coast Guard approval. So.
Great, thank you. Philip also has a question. He asks, did you say that the false work was mounted on barges? And if so, how did they account for tidal changes?
I don't, this is again where I have to say I'm an educator, not an engineer. One of the things that I do, in fact, they generally kind of go the other way when they see me coming, is I go ask engineers all kinds of things. I'm still not completely clear on how the Caisson works. So every once in a while I'll go down and say, wait, if you do this, won't this happen? Kind of a thing. But yeah, it's basically is a temporary structure. My understanding is it kind of sinks more or less. It's kind of a weird, because it's got the weight of the bridge structure on it. So it's more a case of it's not going to float the way a regular boat would float, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, Philip?
It could also be just chiming in with my limited knowledge of barges. Just speculating that it's possible they could have been a spud barge, which is a type of barge that they put like these big feet down into the
There you go, Sarah.
They anchor themselves that way. That's a guess. That's an educated guess.
You know what? That makes a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to need you to send me that information, Sarah, so I can check it out.
I don't know if they would be able to do it like in a really deep part of the river, but
it's not really deep.
Speculation.
I think that part of the river is more like 40 to 50 feet. It's not, the deepest part is through the highlands where the Bear Mountain is. It's not as deep as you would think it is. And there's a whole lot of bottom to go through before you get to the bottom. The Hudson River's been around for a lot of years, and it's got a lot of sediment down there. So, but yeah, that makes sense here.
I called it once a potato barge, and the captains looked at me, and I was like, "Yeah, the thing that puts feet down." Like a spud barge. Bud potato, that's the same thing,
There you
right?
go. Yep, that's pretty funny.
Anyway.
Any other questions or?
Yes, so Robert says, is bridge maintenance like painting performed on all bridges, and is color change an issue?
They try to keep them the same color. It's funny, the Newburgh Beacon, they had to do some painting on the north span. And because, as most of you I'm sure know, they're having an issue getting materials, particularly paint. And the Bridge Authority had a stockpile of that particular brown paint. So the contractor used the Bridge Authority's paint for what their work is, and then they'll replace that. They're different. Each of the bridges are different colors. The Rip is similar to the Mid-Hudson. But no, I don't think it's a problem with matching. I mean, they're pretty good at long range planning. The Bridge Authority, they have short-term maintenance that the regular crews do, and there's crews on every bridge. And then they have long-term plans. It's a 5 and 20-year plan that they work with general contractors on redecking and repainting and major stuff. But touch-up is always done by the regular maintenance guys. And they do that every year. The first thing they do in the spring is wash down every bridge. And you would think, I don't know, all that stuff's going in the river. Well, when it rains, all that stuff's going in the river. So it's really just a case of getting the bridge, any of the materials and dirt and everything off of the bridge. And it really has made a difference in keeping these bridges in good shape, to the point where a lot of other authorities are doing that now. I have to say that, when I was studying about the Kingston Rhine Cliff, it's only 2 years older than the Tappan Zee, the original Tappan Zee. And in my first book, I had the construction of the Tappan Zee and the George Washington. And a lot of the contractors came upriver from doing the Tappan Zee to doing the Kingston Rhine Cliff. Kingston Rhine Cliff is still in fine shape, so it's all that, of course, they needed more bridge at the TZ, so there's more to it than just the bridge was not in great shape. But do we really want to replace bridges when you can keep them in good shape? So far in the Hudson Valley, we're doing okay. At some point, they're going to need more because we just are getting more and more population. But, I just keep saying, more people pick up a cup of coffee on their way to cross the bridge, and it costs more for that cup of coffee than the toll. So as far as I'm concerned, that's money well spent.